Hello, I am your host, Ebie Hepworth, and this is the Let Me Ask You This podcast. I am so thankful that you're here. You could literally be anywhere right now, and you're choosing to be here listening to this conversation, and I want to tell you I don't take that lightly, so thank you. This episode is on grief, and it's actually with one of my best friends, Lauren Numedal, who was on an episode a couple weeks prior. But in this episode, she is technically the host of the podcast, and she's interviewing me. I was driving down the road, and I was just praying, just asking the Lord, like, what do you want to talk about on this podcast? Who do you want? You know, all the things. And I just felt so close to my heart, like, you need to talk about grief. And then out of nowhere, Lauren sends me a message, and she's like, hey, I feel like on your podcast, you need to do an episode on grief. Like, I would totally be open to interviewing you if that's something that would help. And I'm like, yeah, that would help. So she literally comes over, presses record. I have no idea what questions she's going to ask. And so this conversation truly is a very unfiltered, just a raw conversation on the topic of grief. And just, yeah, it's very, very nuanced. And so I just want to say, as you listen into this, please know that wherever you are, whatever season you find yourself in, or if you happen to be in a grieving season, please know my heart is with you. I know the weight and just the intention that a season like that demands. And so without further ado, here is the episode on grief on the Let Me Ask You This podcast. Okay, do you guys remember Lauren from our last conversation? Our minds think so similarly, and we were talking a couple weeks ago, and we were like, there needs to be a conversation on grief. Mm-hmm. And this is just a solo. I'm just riding this thing solo. Riding solo. And I was like, would you interview me for it? Could we have a conversation about it? And she was like, absolutely.
Yeah.
So here we are.
So
today, Lauren is your host, and I am the guest on the Let Me Ask You This podcast. And yeah, we're just going to dive right in.
It's going to be great.
Also, we'll preface with, I have no idea what question she's going to ask. And so this is truly just a conversation that's going to flow from the heart.
I told her I'm not giving her questions because she's so well spoken anyways. Yeah, well, I think a couple weeks ago I was just driving, and I had the thought that, gosh, we don't talk about this enough, especially in the church, I feel like. And I feel like when people go through hard things, I mean, you and I have both seen this so much, like early 30s, middle age, you know.
Yeah. Middle-aged women.
Just kidding. Early 30s, like walking with the Lord through our 20s, and life happens in your 20s. You're like kind of growing up, you're an adult, and loss, breakups, like marriage, dating, children having terminal disease, like so many things. And you and I have unfortunately seen the outcome of just not being able to navigate grief and not knowing how to hold that tension with like all these things that we believe about God, that like God is good and God is healer and God is kind and God is merciful to me and God has spoken these promises to me, or like even the fruition of a promise, and then wait, that promise now has something really painful attached to it. Like, how do you reconcile that? And I think, I don't want to say you're known for, but you've had to navigate hard things. You've
so many different
dealt
colors of grief. Yeah.
Anyways, you've navigated it really beautifully. You've held the tensions really beautifully. And if there's one thing I can say about you, it's that everything you've walked through, it has led you closer to Jesus. Mm-hmm. And I think that's the key. But actually walking that out is not as easy as that sentence may sound.
Yeah. Definitely. I've stepped into a maturity of grief, and I think I've seen my immaturity in grief reveal itself in a lot of ways. I still see my immaturity in grief.
Yeah.
But I've seen the way that grief for me, and even the way that the world defines grief, I've seen them both collide, and I've had to wrestle with, like, what am I actually grieving because I lost something? What am I grieving because the world tells me to grieve? Is this grieving, or is this suffering, or is it like, there's just so many like rivers of sorrow that kind of like bleed together. I don't know.
Yeah.
And so I'll just even come out of the gate with that I think grief is very gray.
So what would you say has been, and this is probably very nuanced, but like just thinking over the last however many years, what would you say has been the hardest part about grieving?
Oh, the hardest part about grieving. I think the hardest part about grieving is navigating the difference between loneliness and aloneness. Because I think when grieving by nature requires you to be alone, and so it's naturally very lonely.
Yeah.
And learning how to fill a gap of space physically, emotionally, spiritually, like with just the Lord, which often feels very lonely. I'm not saying that when you're abiding in Christ, it's not lonely. There's like, but to the flesh, it is so lonely.
Yeah.
Like there's such a level of depth and hiddenness that one has to really venture into, and just silence and solitude. And I'm not saying that's the only way to grieve, because there's so many different, processes of a journey within grief, but understanding, okay, this is a season of aloneness with the Lord, that I'm going to have to fight the flesh of loneliness and really abide and know what is he saying to me in this? What does he want me, who does he want to be for me in this? And every single type of grief, he will reveal a different part of him. And it's such a journey, and honestly struggle. Like it's brutal to be like, to come to a place of like, I've never known you as provider, and I've needed you as, and it's vulnerable. I've never known you as healer. I've needed you as like, and I mean, just as a human, and especially so many in the generation we live in of, content, and everybody's a TikTok scholar, and you have so many great podcasts and all this, and trying to aloneness requires to filter out the noise of the world and really like be like, okay, I'm going to be alone with you. What does your word say? Who do you say I am? Who are you to me in this? And so I think that's probably the hardest part of grief, is silencing that, and like silencing the flesh of wanting to, like, that's why when you watch people break up, or you watch people tragic things where they're like, oh, and then you are watching them swing to this other side of like, they're so busy and they're doing all this. It's because it's like, you want to do. And in seasons of grief, to like learn how to be when you just had something taken from you, it feels so counterintuitive. What can I do? How can I, like, I just want to, this pain. I mean, we've talked about this a million times. There's so much pain. Yeah. And so what do I do with all this lingering like fountain of pain, and to learn how to be silent in that? I would say, and it doesn't ever get easier. It doesn't matter how many painful things somebody goes through. It is like you are always right back at A of the process, and then you're like, and that doesn't mean that there's not history to build on, and you can look back at how the Lord's grieved with you in previous seasons, but it's because no type of pain is ever similar. You have to reteach your spirit, and it's like so hard. Yeah,
that's real.
And you never know how long it's going to be. Yeah. Like your season you're in, you're like, okay, so like, is this like the last lap of my mile, or are we like doing 40 more laps? Like, and so having the questions within it just feels so stagnant to your healing journey, because there is no date in which you're like, oh, I bet I'll feel better in a month, or I bet I'll feel better. Like,
so what would you say like to that? I have a couple of thoughts to everything you just said. Hopefully I remember them. But what would you say to the person who's like in the place where they feel like they're on lap 40 and they feel like they may have 40 more to go? Like, what is it for you that's the fuel to the fire to be like, I'm going to keep pressing in. This is worth it. Yeah. Like, what would you say to like provoke hope into the person who's weary and grieving?
Yeah. Man, another thing that I was writing about actually recently is the Greek word for beauty is fear, Pheer, and the Greek word for ashes is Epher, Epher. All you have to do is rearrange the letters. And so the words beauty and ashes are literally the exact same letters. It's just rearranged.
Wow.
And so I have had moments where I'm like, and that I read that probably 3 years ago.
Profound.
Yeah, I read it 3 years ago. It'll come to a book to you someday. Someday.
To your local bookstore.
To your local Barnes and Noble.
Elizabeth.
But when I read it, and I had that whole chapter written for years, I have thought of that experience in multiple moments. Even just like in a moment, I'll stop and I'll be like, all God has to do is rearrange. Like the ingredients in which to make beauty falls in the ingredients that is made in ashes. And so I will literally close my eyes and be like, how are you going to rearrange this? You are the God who rearranges. Like, what are you going to move around? And I can't tell you how many times I've come back to that. And so much of how, and everybody says this is not some revolutionary experience, but so many times you will look back and be like, wow, the intimacy that was carved within that. Like that is truly the breeding place for all intimacy. That's why it says he's close to the brokenhearted. Like it is wild. Like that is, and so for me, when we sing all these songs and we talk about intimacy with Jesus, and if we're taking it seriously, it's like, if a broken heart is truly this magnet for you and your voice and knowing who you are, then I really like, far be it from me to like avoid grief and avoid a broken, like, so I want to be somebody who understands and experiences Jesus in multi facets. I never want to like dilute who he can be for me all because I avoided grief and avoided pain and avoided processing like hard things, you know? And so, I think, and I've said this many times, but I think when you don't process pain, like unprocessed pain will naturally metastasize into hopelessness. Yeah. And hopelessness is poison to the heart. Yeah. And the heart is which all the things that you say. And so if you're breaking it down to like even a molecular level, like the genetic makeup of a thriving, abiding, Christ-filled life is joy and grief. Like it's being able to process pain, so then your heart remains hopeful, and then you're able to speak life, and then there's this rhythm in which your life starts to form, and you start moving forward understanding, okay, life is hard. Like in Ann Voskamp, the same book, she talks about how by the lie that your life is supposed to always be heaven on earth, then you've bought into the ultimate lie. Like it's like life is hard. Yeah. And so if I'm able to process pain moment by moment, day by day, and get into this like courageous, like heart, like armor, this like perspective of like, okay, I'm going to process. And that's why community, that's why the word, that's why silent prayer, that's why journaling. There's so many different important steps to learning how to grieve that I'm good at some, and others I really am poor at that I want to grow in. But that's why when you add them all together, it's like while you look at somebody who's extremely strong, extremely like abiding in the Lord, extreme, like you look at someone and you're like the depth in which they have in the Lord, I can guarantee they have done the deep work. They have processed those things, and that's why it hasn't metastasized into bitterness and hopelessness and like ego and self-coping, and you take things in your own hands, and all of a sudden you're like, whoa. And so I would say, gosh, that's such a long answer.
It's great.
But yeah, just like processing pain and gosh, just being willing to do the hard stuff.
Yeah, that's so significant. And I'm just like smiling as you say it because it's so countercultural, right? It's like,
it's so not sexy to grieve.
No. And it's like literally we're like, I think it's this might be a broad statement, but I feel like as humans in general, like maybe one of the scariest things to people is grief. Like
it's terrifying.
Like losing someone they love, like all these things, right? When you think about it, you're like, oh, we are actually terrified of grief, and we will avoid pain at all costs.
Oh yeah.
And with that comes addictions and numbing out and scrolling on your phone and busyness, like you said, and all these things, and
all things that I'm guilty of that I just want to
Yeah,
say. Like,
yeah.
yeah, that self-coping is so real.
yeah. I'm going to say this question so I don't forget it. And then I want to say one thing. Like, one, I would love for you to touch on, because you've said, like, okay, I've matured in how I grieve. So I would love to hear, like, what that process maybe used to look like versus what it is now. But one thought when you were sharing that is, I don't know if you've listened to it, but I'm sure you have, Bill Johnson's sermon 3 days after Ben passed.
Yes, dude, that one wrecked me.
Literally wrecked. So significant. But he says, like, today is the only day that I will be able to offer this form of worship to the Lord. And I was like, oh my gosh. He's like, I don't want to miss it. Like, because I will, like, in heaven, worship won't be a choice. It's just what it is.
Yeah.
Here, we have the choice to worship through suffering, grieving, loss, pain. We only have that opportunity while on earth. And so I don't want to miss a moment to worship.
Yeah.
And I'm like, whoa, that's like, so when I heard that, it's so profound. But anyways, I would love to hear.
I think how you respond to grief often will reveal what you believe about God. And so that's why this foundational understanding, who do you believe that he is? That's why A.W. Tozer's, everyone quotes the quote, what you think about God is the most important thing about you. Yeah. It's like, when rubber hits the road, who is he? Yeah. And I've even said this before. I think that's why Jesus revealed himself to a woman first when he rose from the grave, was she was willing to grieve. Like, he found her in the grief. Yeah. And it takes incredible courage. It takes incredible boldness. It takes incredible vulnerability. Yeah.
And I think it's interesting because, I mean, the church we go to is very much like heart and healing and vulnerability and honesty, and like, okay, lament is as equally as important as celebration. And, but I would say the church at whole,
that's not
does
common.
Not have that.
Yeah.
Which, no hate on the church. It's just the reality. I think it's a byproduct of our culture. But it is actually easier to sugarcoat pain and say, but God is good. And like, but he's promised this to you, and put all these like promises and even slap scripture on pain as a mechanism to avoid the process. Right. And then I think we see the fallout of that, which is like, wait, how do these things how does my pain then coincide with that statement? Because I don't understand. Oh yeah. And there's no one to help me bridge this tension.
And we're afraid to ask the hard questions. Yeah. And that, you know, somebody doesn't get healed and you're like, wait. Yeah. You in one moment could heal. Yeah. Why didn't you? Why haven't you? Yeah. Why aren't you? Yeah. And it takes such courage to ask Jesus questions. Yeah. And I don't know. I've heard so many different conversations on all the sides of never ask him why, or he's not afraid to question, these two extremes. And I personally side on the like, if you were afraid of my questions, then dear Lord, I don't think we'll get along, because 99% of our conversations are questions. Yeah. Even his first question, he asks questions. Yeah. Then I will, you know, like, Eve, where are you? That was the first question that echoed in all of eternity, and it's continued through all of eternity. Yeah. Where are you? He asks that question to all of these different, specifically women, where are you? And so I have asked him the same question. Where are you in this? Yeah. I'm not saying I don't trust you. I have gotten even to that point where I've said, I'm seeing, I actually don't trust you. Yeah. Wow. The lack of trust in which is in me is not even existing. Like, and I've gotten to that point, but I think it's just like getting to that space within grief where you are able to ask questions that will, from a posture of faith. Yeah. This like trust, like, God, I really love you. And I really, really do trust you. But like, what's the point? Yeah. Why? Like, why did it, like, what? You know, walk me through that one. And it's just so hard to ask those questions. Yeah. And it's also so important to do them privately, but then also process with safe people those same questions. Like, obviously you're one of those people that I'm just like, this is like, what do you guys like? So I'm struggling with this, and what do you think? And having those wise people, you know, you having somebody like Wendy, having these mentors that are like, I don't know, but and then typically, hopefully leading you to scripture. And
I don't want to be hyperbolic, but I think it was one of the most significant like moments. And I think I'll say that for a long time. When I was grieving last year, and I actually was so mad at God. And in most of the hard things I've walked through in my life, I've been able to point my finger at a person to blame. As someone who is guilty of causing the pain. And I was in a circumstance where I didn't feel like I had a finger to point. So therefore I'm like, God, you caused this.
Right.
Like, I don't know how to reconcile this. And it was the first time navigating that type of, in that, like, I have healing and stuff that I've waited on, but in the level of intensity of the feeling in my heart, feeling like it attributed to God, and the anger was pointed at God. And I was just like, straight up, I want nothing to do with you. And then that created such shame in me, honestly. And I'm like, I don't want to go to church. Like, I'm finding it hard to be around people and like raise my hands and worship you and declare that these
100%.
words are true.
Yeah.
And I like let my closest friends into that. But I'll never forget, after church one day, I went over to Wendy, my mentor, and she's like, how are you doing? I'm like, not good. Like, I am so angry. And I have actually never felt this angry at God in my whole life. And she's like, that's okay. And I was like, huh? And I was like, I'm not reading my Bible. I'm not praying. I'm not like putting worship on my TV. I'm not putting worship in my car. Like, and she's like, that's okay. And I was like, what? And it was just this, like, she's like, Lauren, Jesus is right next to you. He's on the end of the couch when you're crying. Like, he's in your passenger seat. He's with you. You know that. And it's okay for you to say, I want nothing to do with you right now. But the second you're like, I'm ready to be held, like, you can crawl up on his lap and he will father you and hold you while you grieve and reveal himself to you. And it was just like so profound to me, because I think it just shifted my mindset of like, and she was like, now it wouldn't be okay to stay in this place forever.
Yeah.
Like, there's an expiration date on this. And like, you're going to have to pick yourself back up and pick the Bible back up. And,
yeah.
But it was just so significant to be like, okay, what the anger you're feeling is so valid.
Yeah.
And God can handle it.
100%.
Yeah.
But I had, okay, so you were on this journey with us, but years ago, and this is what I had just last week had finished in the book, and I talk about, the title of the chapter is Close But No Cigar. And I talk about how when out of nowhere I get the call about IVF after 7 years, you know, of infertility. I didn't even know that there was a clinical trial going on. Basically, long story short, somebody that I still to this day have no idea who put me on this list enrolled me, put my information, and I got a call that I was going to get IVF fully paid for. At the point, we had no money, so it wasn't even an option to talk about. They call us, they're like, you're the perfect candidate. All the stars align. I have to get surgery to be a part of this IVF trial. I have to take injections for almost 6 months. It was this whole thing, but I was so happy because IVF, $30,000. All these doctors telling me I was never a candidate for IVF. And so I was like, this is God. Yeah. Out of nowhere. It's not like I chased it down. It would be different if I was knocking on every doctor. And this doctor, I'm out on my patio watching the kids play with the hose, and a random IVF trial coordinator calls. And so for 6 months, I am like going through it. And they test my estrogen. I have to have my estrogen at a certain point. And you get 3 tries, and the whole time I'm doing so amazing. They didn't even think anything was going to happen. And I tested the first time, and it has to be at 20, my estrogen. And it was at like 48. And they're like, oh no, it's too high, but it's okay. We have 2 more times. And I'm like, okay. And at this point I've been doing injections. It's this whole thing. And then they tested again. It was at 32. And they're like, shoot, okay, we have 1 more test. And, trials are very specific. And in my head, I'm like, this is like, honestly, he's so in like 9-hour God, like 11th hour. I mean, like he's gonna like, this is the best story. This is a rom-com. And I was so confident that that this was a God thing, because it came out of nowhere, that I got my vlog camera out when my phone rang for the last one, because I was like, it's happening. I get my vlog camera out. I'm like, and as she calls, I press record, and I'm like, hey, Krista. And she's like, I said, do you have good news? And she goes, no, I don't. And I remember thinking, like, my heart, and I'm like, you know. And all I could think about in my response on the phone, I said, so close but no cigar. And this concept of almost having something is almost painful than having something just tragically taken. Yeah. When you are so close to something you deeply want, having to reconcile reality with what you almost had is excruciating. Yeah. And so anyway, this whole chapter, I'm unpacking this concept of grieving almost. And it's weird because your imagination takes off with what that could have been. A relationship, a child, a career, a move, a house, whatever. Yeah. We are dreaming beings. And so, and especially when you're in the lens of faith, you are like, God can do it. You know, there is no cap on what he will do. And so, and in the Bible, Psalm 73, and since probably 10 years ago, one of my first like hard things that were not first, gosh, my whole life's been hard, but one of the biggest pillars of pain that I had to walk through, I remember reading Psalm 73. And at the very beginning of the Psalm, and it's the first Psalm of Asaph, which everyone thinks, this is not David. This is Asaph, which is one of 3 of the leaders of the Levites that David had anointed to be basically the main worship leader of his whole temple. And so it's his very first Psalm. And it talks about, he comes out of the gate and he's like, I was praising you. I loved you. And then he says, my foot almost slipped. I almost fell. And he keeps using the word almost. And then the rest of the Psalm is like, I don't get it. These people that don't even love you have no pain. Yeah. These people that literally don't trust you, don't believe in God, look at them. They have everything they could ever want. Look, she has this. She's healthy. She's whole. Her body doesn't ache. Oh, look, she has the baby that she wants. Oh, look, he has this, like, and it talks about how all these people that don't even believe in the Lord have. And then it comes, I think it's like verse 14, and it says, but then I entered the sanctuary of the Lord. That's all it says. And then it comes back to like the reality. And then the very end is like, and then I remembered that you are my inheritance, that one moment, and it goes into this whole thing basically about how one moment in the sanctuary of the Lord brought him back to his foot being secure. And then he talks about how no matter where you take me, I know that I trust you. You are my heart, my soul. Like, but I have gone to that Psalm so many times because my foot has almost slipped. Yeah. I have almost fallen. Yeah. And it's when you take this look off of what is happening to me and you are looking at all the people, especially social media, all you see is everyone's best moments. Yeah. Everyone's dreams coming true. Everyone's dream house. Everyone's marriage is perfect. Like, but when you take a look at that, it's so easy for your footing to fall. Yeah. And then that's when you watch people not get what they want and they're battling with disappointment. And then you see them when they were firm in the Lord, and then they experience something brutal, and then you watch them wander. Yeah. And every single time we watch it all day long with people that come in the space of our faith and our community. And every time I want to be like, but then you entered the sanctuary of the Lord, the house, the local church. And I'm not a pastor. I'm not on staff, but like the sanctuary of the Lord. Yes. Even when you break that exegesis down, the sanctuary of the Lord is different. I'm not saying that you have to be in this building, be in a living room, be in a house church, be in a space, but the sanctuary of the Lord, the whole point of a sanctuary in that specific Psalm, in that specific, it breaks down how a sanctuary is supposed to highlight the sacrifice. And so in a space of absolute grief, when your foot is almost slipping, and the whole language of this is that his faith, he was like, I'm almost done. I've been worshiping the Lord at that point. I think he's in his 40s or 50s is what they say. He'd been worshiping the Lord his whole life, almost fell. And then he entered the sanctuary, Lord. So if you can go into a space and be like, the sacrifice of the Son was enough, that the cross is enough, the blood of Jesus, if I sing it and I'm declaring it, then that is enough. So regardless of what happens to me, if my greatest nightmare actually unfolds, do I believe that the blood of the Lamb was enough? Or am I buying into this theology that my life, that comfort and perfection and my dream life is actually what I deserve?
Right.
That the blood of Jesus, and it's such a, because like, yes, you believe and you hope and you see things for what they're not because of the lens of faith. And so sometimes it's this weird like tension, but when you can come into the sanctuary and being like, the blood is enough. And it goes back to answer your first question. How do you like maintain hope? You get to that sanctuary and you like, do I believe that when you died on the cross, that was it right there? You sealed the deal of love. Was that the ultimate sacrifice? Or did you die on the cross to give me a baby? Or did you die on the cross to give me a marriage? Or did you, and maybe he did, and I'm not saying, but also maybe there's a calling on your life to experience him when, because it's a fallen world and people mess up and people die and disease happens and all these different things. Maybe this is also something for you to be able to like abide and soar and hide under his wing and see him in a different way than you ever have. And it's just, it's so hard in moments and seasons and decades of grief to be like, do I actually believe that the blood of the Lamb was enough?
Yeah. Well, even the word, it's like, okay, I remember having this thought like, gosh, probably 5 years ago, but well, not thought, but revelation of like, okay, I'm promised suffering. Like the word promises us suffering. And that even that in itself can be hard to reconcile from like a quote unquote good God. You know, it's like, why would you promise suffering to people you love? And then it's like all the scriptures of like testing produces character and endurance and endurance, hope. And, and it's just like, I think even in, for better or for worse, like I look at people who suffer well and I trust them
100%
because I'm like, you have had to make significant choices and you still stand speaking of the confidence of who God is, not just to the world, but to you on the other side of loss or heartbreak or pain. And that creates trust in my human heart
100%
for those people. So what would like, I think navigating, I have so many thoughts, but like, how do you, this goes back to the question we didn't ever circle back to of like practical tools
and maturity
but like this might be looped in, you can take this wherever you want, but how do you hold the tension of who I know God is, what he says, that he is healer, that he is all of these things, provider, protector, and the physicality of the not yet of the things you're believing for, whether that be a parent that's an addict or your own body that's sick or someone you love that's sick or hoping for children or a marriage, or like, how do you hold that tension with hope? Or what are even questions that you have asked God that give you peace or revelation that like, okay, I don't have to necessarily know why, but if I know this about you, like I can keep going.
Yeah, because I've always imagined hope as like the fuel that makes the bride drive or run or whatever. And it's almost as if you make it an equation. Okay, well, if you say that hope is what gives me the endurance to keep going, then how do I produce it? Where do I get it? You know, what's coming to mind right now is the Romans 15, I think 13. And it's like the NLT, I think it says, is because I trusted, there was a surplus of joy and peace and then I was abounding in hope is like, but I've always looked at that and seen it almost as if it's like a math equation, almost as like the transitive property, A plus B equals C. I'm like, oh wait, so then do they all equal each other? And so, and Taylor, your sister, says this a lot of like, trust flows from the fruit in a heart of love. Like, and so when you deeply love something, you're going to trust it.
Yeah.
And so if I can really, really love, then I'll trust. That's natural fruit from that. And if I trust, then the word is telling me that I'll be abounding in hope. When you can ask those hard questions and come to a space of really, really loving Jesus for who he is and what he's done for you, then I think that you'll be able to understand that he's worthy of walking through any trial that comes your way with. He died an unbearable death so then I could live. And if my one chance at life happens to be faced with multiple challenges, then so be it. And I will be with him in it. Yeah. And then the fruit of my life is someone that had endurance and tenderness and remained soft. And like you said, like you don't trust people that haven't gone through it. Like you just see this whole new level of suffering and you're like, you know what? Look at the fruit on that person's life. That is a walking mini Christ. Yeah. Wow. And that's the other thing I will say. When you do look out at other people, there is a way where you can, like, there's always someone who's suffered more than you. Yeah. There is always someone that's been through a lot harder stuff. And so when you can look at other people that have navigated sorrow and you're like, and they're still standing, you're like, I can do it too. Totally. Because
just read Paul's life.
Yeah. And you're like, because of he who is in me, it has nothing to do with me. Like, oh yeah, I think hope is like the greatest wrestle of all time. And I think it's like, there's so many, like you said, practical things that you can obviously do to be able to breed hope within you. And it's obviously the word. I lately, the last couple months, I haven't done this in a long time, but I have been reading my Bible out loud because I'm like, I need this to stay. I can tell for me when my hope meter is low, I'm like, whoo. And typically that's like when I have my SOS moments. The other thing that's in that Psalm that's really helped me is it talks about the sanctuary Lord, and it basically unpacks when you get a different vantage point. And typically if you can step outside of your highly emotional perspective and try and get it from a different perspective, different vantage point, typically that will help reframe it. And then you can kind of, but sometimes I think people have this concept of hope that there's only so much of it and you have to like grab it. And like, you're just like, but there's always a surplus abundant amount of hope available. Yeah. And so, to someone who's like, oh, I used all my hope tokens like in the last trial. It's like, no. There's a new level of fresh waves of hope that get to come and overwhelm you for this now moment. Yeah. You know, so.
Yeah, that's really good. And maybe you don't even see this, but I feel like I'd be curious. So earlier you mentioned, okay, it's so necessary to grieve alone, which is true. 'Cause that's like, you can only iron out pieces of that with you and the Lord and hearing his voice clearly. I feel like I've seen a shift in you carrying grief and allowing other people to shoulder it with you.
Yeah, I've
in
grown
the last
a lot in that
year and a half. And I would just be curious to hear your thoughts, perspective. Has that been good? Has that been hard? Has that been fruitful? There's like, as your friend, it's like, I think of like getting the call at the Wipe Every Tear office and showing up at your house on Ashland and like shortly after the call. And there's so much in your story that I can't relate to. And I think from my own experience, and I think that can be even hard in friendship on both sides. Yeah. I think of even you guys, you can't understand being 30 and single when you got married in your early 20s. Right. But I know I'm better for letting you in, even though you can't understand that. And I know you guys want to be let in, even though you can't understand that experientially. Yeah. And so yeah, I would just be curious what
100%.
led to that
Yeah.
shift and what it's looked like to walk that out.
Yeah, I feel like I'm just giving away chapters of my book right now, which is this. If you're listening to this and you've been waiting, the 4 people
Still buy the book.
So I have grown and being able and being willing to let people carry me. And I had such a level of pride with my weakness. Like, and it's so funny because even I wouldn't have used that language, 4 or 5 years ago. I would have just been like, gosh, this is a holy thing with just the Lord. And I would stamp that on it and be like, this is honestly a private, tender thing. I'm digging a well over here. So like, you can just butt out over there. And what I do give you the crumbs of it, you can just, and it's, yes, there is that in grief. And you never want to, share too early. I watch people prematurely share and it burdens me. Last year we were in you've heard this a lot, so sorry. But last year we were almost done with year 2 of our clinical trial with Asa. And if someone sent you this podcast to catch your speed on my life, I guess I probably should have given some pain points like you said at the beginning, but my son has a, terminal illness, it's Duchenne muscular dystrophy, and it's a muscle degenerating disease, and his DNA has a mutation in it. And so this clinical trial, similar to the one that I was in, it just like I had knocked, this is the one trial because his mutation is so rare that he qualifies in the whole world. And I had knocked on these 2 companies that are in charge of this specific type of therapy for years, literally years. And one of the main one was one of the main creators of one of the biggest COVID vaccines. So they were obviously busy. So from 2017 until 2021, I called these 2 pharmaceutical companies literally monthly. I got personal numbers. I was like, I'm going to be the woman that knocks. They're going to let my son into this because I wouldn't stop knocking. And so praise be to God, after COVID, the whole world shuts down. Later, finally, Asa gets into it. We've been in it for 2.5 years. And basically last fall, I came into a space where I thought I was letting people in. I thought I was doing a good job of letting people carry me. I think because I was aware, sometimes an awareness will almost allow someone to be extra manipulative, because when you're aware of what people need, like they're like, oh, they probably can tell I'm not doing good. You can usually fill that space with either truth or false. And I had been really good up until that point of making people not worry about me because I knew what to say.
Sure.
And also, I mean, I've shared this a million times, but when your life, there's so many parts of your life that's hard. You don't always want to be the girl that's just bringing it up every time you're hanging out. And so you're like, hey, like, let's just have fun. And and so there's so many layers to that. But I hit a wall last year where the loneliness was going to swallow me up. And I was like, and you get into that again, into Psalm 73, where you're looking out and you're like, no one would ever know how hard this is. No one. And you just get in your own head. And I was looking out at church. I was at church, everyone's worshiping. And I was like, nobody even likes me here. Like this little tiny thought of I'm the only one, it just infects. And all of a sudden it takes off. And you're like, it's just pointing fingers. And I was in my head, like, nobody likes me. Nobody understands this pain. They like me, but they don't love me. Or they love me, but they don't like me because the church has to love me because I'm a part of the bride. And so it's going to come and they're going to love me, but they don't actually like me. Oh, also, they just like my gifts. They like my ability to make them feel seen and or whatever, but they don't actually like me. And I got into this pit. And long story short, I tell Zach and he's like, wow, I think you really need to have something is not right. The other thing though, I will say is when I started saying all this to Zach, I was influencing even him. And I remember him starting to really struggle. And I will say, when you are grieving, you have an incredible level of power. You can influence people into different ways of thinking if you manipulate your grief into a unfiltered, unsanctified, it's scary. And so grief is so serious. It's like serious business of the kingdom. It needs to be handled seriously. And so I even remember influencing the way Zach was seeing people. And he's like, wait a minute. Yeah, I don't think people like me, And then he's like, wait, I think that you need to have some really hard conversations. So Zach has conversations. I have hard conversations. And it helped, but it was just kind of like, hey, this is where I'm at. And it was like, okay, well, we love you and this, But then a couple weeks later, we're at this women's event at church. And I remember not even wanting to go. I had a bad attitude. And one of my good friends comes up to me and she's like, hey, I have a gift for you. The Lord asked me to get this for you. And she gets me this baggage. And she gets me Bay's like really cute black luggage. And I remember she handled it. And she was like, I know you're going to Salt Lake for the trial. And I just thought maybe if you're going every week, you could at least have cute luggage. And I remember literally hearing the Holy Spirit saying, she's giving you the gift of baggage. Whoa. She literally wants to carry your baggage. She bought you cute luggage that you're not letting anyone carry. Like, and all of a sudden, and I just started weeping. She's like, wow, I got her a duffel bag and she's a mess. And I was like a mess. I get in my car and I'm like, wow, like, that's another thing I will say is when you learn how to comfort someone in a season of sorrow, it activates the bride to be the bride in a way that is so breathtaking and remarkable. So and you're like, they would not have been the bride in that moment had I not leaned into my suffering. And it's like, I just even, it's like, I could get on that one all day. Yeah. But it started to open me up saying that was her trying to help carry. She didn't know how to help me, but this was how she tried. And she saw me. It was so silly how I needed that. And so I opened the Bible. I'm like, okay, Lord, I need to talk with you about this. What is happening? And I'm like, God, show me what grief looks like. And he brings me to the garden. And this is the epitome of what grief looks like. He's in the garden. He's grieving so much that he's actually crying blood. And it's like, and in that moment, what he does is he asks of his closest friends to come and surround him. And it says, take watch, remain with me, which in Greek, remain means to abide, like, which is almost like spoon me, like hold me, like, and I look at that and I'm like, in his deepest moment of grief, he brought people in. Yeah. He believes in this concept of community grief. His closest homies fall asleep, which means that like he didn't even necessarily want their, oh, you got this, and their ego, and their, oh, come on. They're like, all he wanted was their eye contact and their remaining. Yeah. And so I think even feeling the weight, there's so many different kind of lanes you could go with that. You can bring people into your grief. They may not always know what you need. They may not always give you what you want, but they're with you. Bring them in, And then the other side of the coin is like that. Had they not let him down, because he's like, you're sleeping. Are you kidding? You're sleeping. Can you not stay awake for 2 hours and pray with me? Even him being disappointed in his best friend's response to how he was grieving, it then uttered this prayer out of him. He prays something out of his disappointment. Though the body is weak, the spirit is able. And so there's so much that I see in this moment of grief with Jesus. And then he weeps. God, is there another way? He asks God questions in his deepest moment of grief. And I think we sometimes forget that God, the Savior of the world, was a man. Right. And when you can restore the humanity to who he is as God, then you see grief as this holy encounter and exchange in which you're like, wow, I am actually going to exchange what I want for what you want. Like, not my will, but yours. I would rather have a different way, but I trust you. You are the king of the universe. You've done things like, and it just kind of like turns the wheel of like, I trust you.
And that is the perspective shift.
Yes. The vantage point change. Yeah. And it's just like, it changes everything. Yeah. And that is also a love encounter, because all of a sudden you're in love, because you're like, wow, when you can watch how Jesus grieved in the garden and you're like, wow, he didn't even want to do it, but he did because he loved me. Yeah. I was worth that anguish. I was worth that death. And it's just like you said, suffering, it's so promised and we just forget it. And so when we are in it and being able to be like, no, he's worth it. And suffering isn't hinged on if he loves me. He loves me. He proved that he loved me. And so now I get to prove that I love him. Yeah. And now this is my moment of actual like squeezing the oil out of my life and being like, oh, not my will, but yours. And would my thoughts honor you in this wounding moment and in this disappointment, in the waiting of a dream, in the stagnation of like how I wish my life to look? Would I still actually bless your name? Yeah. Would my actual, like, would there be fruit in this, like, Psalms 1, would I be a root planted by a tree planted by the roots of water, that in all seasons I'd bear fruit? Yeah. In a harvest and in a dry season. Like, so yeah, I just think there's so much like Grief is so hard. And even Hind's Feet for Hard Places, you know, the constant companion, that book, if you haven't read it, top 3 most influential books in my life. The only companions that go with her entire journey, that allow her to be able to have feet that can actually withhold like brutal mountains, that famous psalm, is sorrow and suffering. Those are the best 2 companions that will get you to the place in which the shepherd's leading you. And so if you live a life avoiding sorrow and suffering, you will not have the feet that will endure mountains that you were created to be on top of. And so it's just like, oh my gosh, I'm getting all fired up.
No, that's so good. But it doesn't say this in every single gospel, but I was reading this last year and I'm like, whoa, I feel like I've never read this before or been aware. But it says that the disciples that fell asleep in sorrow.
Oh.
And I was like, how have I never read that?
I have to look at that. I've never read that version.
Yeah. And I was like, whoa.
Oh, I'd love to look into that.
It just, whole revelation.
That's
really
something, honestly, I would love to dig into, is the difference between suffering and sorrow.
Yeah.
I think of that often, actually, when Jesus responds to his friends in the garden when he says, though the body is weak, the spirit is willing. I'm like, help. I mean, especially you, when your grief is in the lane of physical pain in your body. Yeah. When someone's listening to this and they have serious chronic pain, it's like, if you can get to a place where you're able to pray, my body, I hate my body, but I know your spirit I love. Yeah. Like, that's wild faith. Yeah.
And it's like, I just have to revisit communion, you know? Yeah. Like, your body broken. And that being like the most intimate. Like, I'm not promised. I know your will and your desire for me is to be healed. But I've been thinking, even in the context of last week, I found out my labrum's torn and it hurts every time I raise my arms in worship, or it hurts my right shoulder. And it has for a long time. But I'm like, how annoying is that it's like, oh, it's like physically interfering to worship. Yeah. But it's one of those things where it's like, okay, Lord, like, you're worth the pain. You are literally, like, my body can't physically not respond to who you are. And I think it's that same thing as you. It's like, if I can just get even the smallest glimpse of his suffering, you know? I was laying on the MRI table this week, feeling alone and in pain and scared and vulnerable and all the things. And I was just like, Lord, like, what do you have to say to me? Like, where are you? What's going on? And he was just like, I'm with you. And I'm like, okay, like, I love your presence, but I love you as healer, you know? Yeah. But it was like, I'm with you, and taking my mind, like, even imagining a place with him that is intimate where I can, like, return to in my mind. But yeah, it's like, okay, whatever the outcome, it like, his presence carries you through it every single time. Yeah. Every single time.
100%.
Like, it breathes hope. It breathes life. It breathes encouragement, courage. Like,
yeah, it infuses it into you. Yeah. That's something my mentor says, is it's like, because of his omnipresence, no mountaintop makes him bigger than any valley makes him smaller. He's equally present in every single moment, which in seasons of grief and in seasons of celebration, that revelation has affected me so much. To think that he is equally as close to me when I cry versus when I smile is wild. Yeah. To think that he's equally close to me when I have no money in my bank account and when it's full. Yeah. Like that, if you can allow that reality to stick permanently, it changes everything.
Yeah. And then just the revelation of the cross. It's like, oh, you have thorns on your head. You are dripping in blood. Your bone is exposed. Like, how can I even complain about a shoulder that hurts? Totally. You know what I mean? Not that he would say that of like, I suffered so much more, 0%. And not that that should ever minimize. Yeah. Not that that should be a mechanism for avoiding your pain. But yes, it's true. When you're like, okay, if you can do that, I can do this.
Oh, for sure. Oh, man. How do you land this plane?
I don't know.
Oh, I think somebody who's listening to this and they're like, I'm just in a season of grief. And, it's so hard to measure grief. I will say if you can learn to love Jesus in the middle of disappointment, then you can do anything. Like, it's truly so hard, but the reward of like just confidence in who he is it's incredible. And when you invest your grief into the Lord, when you invest it into the kingdom, it will return dividends. It always has an increase in your profit. And so I just encourage you to be on your journey and don't assume that it has to look like something you've seen or heard or watched someone else. Like, be individual enough to just, go with him for yourself in the route that he wants to take you. So, wow, that was a lot longer than I had anticipated. I guess when you just open up a can of worms on grief, your girl can talk. So if you're hearing this, I really appreciate you sticking around. I know that's a lot longer of an episode than usual. And to end this episode, I want to say again, I just want to emphasize it means so much that you're here. You could be anywhere and you're choosing to listen to this conversation. I just want you to know from my heart, I really don't take that lightly. So as always, thank you. If something in this episode ministered to you and you somehow decide to post it on socials, please tag me. It so blesses me and just gives me so much momentum and excitement as I continue to steward this podcast. So like I said, means so much you're here, and I hope you have the best rest of your day. We'll see you next week on the Let Me Ask You This podcast.